Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad you could join us.
So whether you are currently sipping a meticulously crafted single origin beverage that took a barista maybe 20 minutes of intense concentration to prepare,
Or if you're just clutching a lukewarm cup of hot water that's been aggressively mixed with some questionable instant powder you found banished to the back of the office pantry.
right, exactly. Whatever your situation is right now, I can promise you this. Today's exploration is going to completely change how you view your daily routine.
It really will.
Because we are looking at something so ubiquitous, so deeply embedded in the rhythm of our global society that we barely even notice the psychological and sociological weight it actually carries.
We are, of course, talking about coffee.
Coffee. But here's where it gets really interesting for us today. We aren't just reading a Wikipedia page about roasted beans.
No agricultural exports of South America today.
Right. We have a genuinely fascinating piece of source material. It's a transcript from an English language learning show, and it's titled Brewing Fluency, The Culture and Lexicon of Coffee.
Which honestly sounds like it should be incredibly dry.
Right. I mean, you hear English language learning show and you immediately picture those robotic, monotone dialogues. Hello, how are you? I'm fine, thank you.
Exactly. But this text is nothing like that at all. It features a highly dynamic conversation between two very distinct, highly opinionated personalities.
Emma and John.
Yes, Emma and John. And on the surface, the text presents itself as an educational tool, a vehicle to teach non-native speakers some advanced idiomatic English expressions.
But when you actually analyze the dialogue, the vocabulary lessons are almost, they're like a Trojan horse.
That's a great way to put it. It becomes something much more profound. It's a brilliant, almost accidental sociological study of modern life.
I completely agree, and that's the real mission of our deep dive today. We are definitely going to unpack the brilliant way this source material uses the global phenomenon of coffee culture as a lens.
A very revealing lens.
Yeah. It's a lens to examine human sociology, our physiological dependencies, the way we construct our modern identities, and how we use language to manipulate value. I mean, Emma and John are literally using a morning beverage to explain the human condition.
And my role today will be to pull those underlying threads together for you. I want to synthesize the linguistic side of what they're discussing with the broader cultural implications.
Because there's a lot to connect there.
There really is. Because what we are truly tracking here is how a simple, functional drink, something historically meant to just keep humans awake, evolved into what Emma so perfectly describes in the text as a baffling exercise in cryptography.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of cryptography, because Emma opens the source text with an anecdote that I think is going to resonate with literally anyone listening to us right now.
Oh, absolutely.
She talks about venturing into one of those newly opened, hyper-modern, artisanal cafes over the weekend. You know the exact type I mean.
Exposed brick.
Yeah, exposed brick, the Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling, baristas wearing those heavy leather aprons.
Industrial chic.
Right. And she says the menu above the register was just utterly bewildering. She was just looking for a simple cup of coffee, and the actual word coffee was conspicuously absent from the entire board.
It's a fantastic observation of modern commercial environments. And I want you to notice what she isn't complaining about here.
The prices?
Exactly. She isn't complaining about exorbitant prices, which is usually the primary grievance people have with boutique cafes. Her barrier to entry wasn't financial.
It was entirely linguistic.
Yes. She was confronted with an impenetrable wall of jargon.
And the specific jargon she mentions is just amazing. She says she's staring at this minimalist menu offering a single origin pour-over, an oat milk cortado, and a cold brew boasting subtle notes of cacao.
Subtle notes of cacao.
Right. And John, her co-host, immediately jumps in and points out the utter absurdity of that phrase. He tells her, "It's a beverage, Emma, not a symphony."
Which is a brilliant response.
But Emma is literally paralyzed. She says she stood there, holding up the line for 2 entire minutes, scrutinizing this board, desperately trying to locate just a conventional, recognizable cup of coffee. And I have to admit, I've absolutely been in Emma's shoes.
Haven't we all?
I mean, just last week, I stared at a menu trying to figure out if blonde roast was a flavor, a brewing method, or just a state of mind.
We've all been there. What's fascinating here is the contrast the text sets up between phonetics and semantics.
Wait, break that down for us. Phonetics versus semantics.
Right, so semantics deals with the actual meaning of the words, what the drink physically is in the real world. Water, crushed beans, milk.
The physical reality of the thing.
Yes. But phonetics is simply how the words sound to the human ear. the musicality of the language itself. And John makes this incredible, very vulnerable confession in response to Emma's paralysis.
Oh, I love this part.
He admits that he actually frequents these avant-garde establishments and actively orders things like an oat milk cortado purely because he is seduced by the phonetics.
Seduced by the phonetics.
Exactly. He openly admits he doesn't have the faintest idea what the actual physical ingredients of a cortado even are.
That is just wild to me. He assumes that because the name sounds sophisticated and vaguely European, the drink itself must be exquisite.
He's evaluating the beverage entirely based on its linguistic appeal.
So what does this all mean for us as consumers? Why on earth do we assign a higher inherent value to items just because they have esoteric, complicated names?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's about language being used as a mechanism for gatekeeping and luxury branding.
Gatekeeping.
Right. When a cafe uses terms like single origin or describes a drink as having subtle notes of cacao, they are signaling exclusivity. They are implicitly telling the consumer, you aren't just buying a quick hit of caffeine, you're participating in a highly cultivated artisanal tradition.
So the complexity of the language implies a complexity in the craft.
Even if, like John, the consumer cannot articulate what a cortado actually is, the mere act of successfully ordering it makes them feel distinguished. They feel like an insider. The language itself is part of the product they are purchasing.
It's linguistic seduction. You aren't buying the bean, you're buying the vocabulary.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that seduction is alienation, which is exactly the trap Emma falls into.
Right.
The language that makes John feel sophisticated makes Emma feel entirely inadequate. She finally gives up on deciphering the cryptography of the menu and just asks the barista a very simple question.
Could I just get a regular coffee?
And the way she describes the barista's reaction is priceless. She says the barista glared at her as if she had committed a cardinal sin.
The cardinal sin of just wanting a normal drink.
The cardinal sin of asking for unpretentious simplicity in a space that has dedicated its entire identity to complexity.
Yeah.
And the barista's response is so beautifully condescending in the text.
Oh, yeah. Instead of just pouring her a cup, they ask if she is seeking a batch filter drip or an Americano.
Which immediately forces her right back into the labyrinth of jargon she was trying to escape.
She just throws her hands up and replies, whichever one ostensibly tastes like coffee.
It highlights a very real modern phenomenon, the intentional intimidation of the consumer.
It really makes you wonder how many other industries rely on this exact same tactic. Think about it. The wine industry is the granddaddy of this.
Oh, absolutely.
Using incredibly poetic, sometimes completely baffling language to describe fermented grape juice. You know, I'm getting notes of leather and damp forest floor.
Damn forest floor is a classic.
The skincare industry does it too, with chemical nomenclature, making a basic daily moisturizer sound like a Nobel Prize-winning scientific breakthrough.
The tech industry is notorious for it as well.
Right. Using acronyms and jargon to create a massive barrier between the experts and the average user, they use linguistic complexity to create an aura of exclusivity. It makes you, the consumer, feel like you need to earn the right to participate.
Which is a highly effective economic strategy. If you can convince someone that they need specialized knowledge just to understand your product, you can charge a premium for it.
It's brilliant, but frustrating.
It raises an interesting point for anyone listening right now. We interact with these linguistic barriers constantly. Think about the last time you felt slightly out of your depth ordering at a restaurant or maybe reading a tech spec sheet for a new phone.
It happens all the time.
The confusion you felt wasn't accidental, it was designed. But on the flip side, we all have a little bit of John in us too. Have you ever bought a shampoo because it claimed to have botanical infusions without actually knowing what a botanical infusion does?
I am absolutely guilty of the botanical shampoo trap.
It is a very common, very human psychological trap.
And this dynamic naturally pushes Emma and John into a massive debate in the text, revealing two completely divergent philosophies on consumption. Emma falls firmly into the minimalist camp, while John is the absolute champion of the artisanal aesthetic.
Yes. The source text sets these two up as perfect foils for one another. Let's look at Emma's camp first. She explicitly states that she craves unpretentious simplicity.
She has zero patience for it.
Zero. No patience for esoteric terminology or complex flavor profiles. She outlines her ideal beverage incredibly clearly.
Dark liquid, piping hot, perhaps a splash of milk?
Exactly. She views the beverage in purely utilitarian terms. In fact, she asks John a very pointed philosophical question in the text. She asks, why must a beverage have a backstory?
Why must it have a backstory? That is so good. To her, coffee is nothing more than a dark, caffeinated liquid in a receptacle.
A dark, caffeinated liquid in a receptacle. It is so incredibly sterile. She strips away all the romance.
But John represents the complete opposite end of the spectrum. He defends the entire experience.
Strongly defends it.
He argues that he is drawn to the ambiance of these upscale cafes, the aesthetic curation of the furniture, the indie acoustics playing softly in the background, and he specifically cites this boutique near his flat that serves a cold brew that undergoes a 12-hour extraction process.
And this is where the transcript masterfully weaves in its vocabulary lessons without feeling forced. Emma and John naturally start debating the concept of how we brew our drinks.
Right, because the text formally defines brewing as the process of extracting flavor by steeping, usually coffee or tea, in water.
But John points out that this specific boutique cold brew doesn't use heat at all. It uses chilled water and extensive time in lieu of thermal heat.
So they are effectively replacing the rapid catalyst of heat with the agonizingly slow catalyst of time.
Which brings up a fascinating cultural observation regarding how modern society signifies quality.
How so?
Well, Emma points out that she can brew a perfectly acceptable pot of coffee in precisely 3 minutes using boiling water, and she simply cannot fathom the rationale behind waiting 12 hours for something that accomplishes the exact same biological goal.
It seems highly inefficient.
It is. But in modern artisanal culture, time and effort are the primary markers of luxury. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been obsessed with speed and efficiency. So now, if something takes 12 hours to make, if it is highly inefficient, we inherently believe it must be superior to something that takes 3 minutes.
The inefficiency itself becomes the selling point.
Exactly. It proves that care was taken. It proves it isn't mass-produced.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here because I somewhat side with Emma on this specific point. Is there actual science behind a 12-hour steep, or is John just falling completely for the artisanal marketing? Because Emma seems to think it's a complete waste of time and human energy.
From a purely chemical standpoint, there actually is a difference.
Really?
Yes. Using cold water over a long period extracts different compounds from the coffee bean than boiling water does, resulting in a brew that is significantly lower in acidity and bitterness. So John isn't entirely delusional here.
Okay, that's fair.
But you're right to question the marketing aspect because John doesn't defend it using chemistry.
No, he doesn't.
He defends it using elitism. He argues that this 12-hour process creates flavor nuances that demand a refined palate.
Yes. He pulls the refined palate card on her. He claims it is the quintessential acquired taste.
And acquired taste is another major vocabulary word they tackle.
Emma uses this great phrase when they're talking about acquired tastes. She points out that it basically means something is initially unappealing, but through sheer stubbornness and repeated exposure, you eventually trick your brain into liking it.
John uses the examples of dark chocolate or drinking coffee black. The bitterness is jarring at first, but your palate adapts and eventually seeks it out.
It's such a weird concept when you really think about it.
It is. And this raised an important question for me when reading the transcript. Have you ever considered the evolutionary biology of bitter flavors?
Oh, wow, no. Where does that tie in?
Well, humans are virtually the only animals that actively seek out bitter-tasting things. In nature, bitterness is almost always a biological warning sign for poison or toxicity.
Because poisonous plants are bitter.
Exactly. Our taste buds evolved to reject bitter flavors to keep us from eating things that would kill us. So an acquired taste for something like black coffee or dark chocolate is literally us overriding our evolutionary survival instincts.
We train ourselves to ignore the poison alarm.
We do. And sociologically, we view this as a sign of sophistication. Being able to enjoy an intensely bitter espresso is a way of signaling that you are highly acculturated. You have mastered your base animal instinct.
That is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So John isn't just defending his cold brew. He's subconsciously signaling his evolutionary superiority.
In a way, yes.
But Emma, wonderfully, stubbornly refuses this entire premise. She insists that to her unrefined palate, all coffee is virtually indistinguishable.
She won't play the game.
No. She finds the bitterness repulsive and says that perhaps her palate will never acquire the taste, and she's perfectly blissfully content with that fact, as long as she has access to milk and sweetener.
It is such a funny dynamic. John is defending the artistry and evolutionary mastery, and Emma is just demanding her hot, sweet liquid.
It perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of coffee as a global phenomenon. It occupies this weird liminal space. It is simultaneously a highly refined artisanal craft with flavor wheels and tasting notes, and a basic utilitarian commodity traded by the ton to keep factory workers awake.
It really makes you wonder which side of the fence you fall on. For you listening right now, are you holding out for that 12-hour extraction with subtle notes of cacao to satisfy your refined palate? Or are you just looking for a hot cup of caffeine before you have to start answering a mountain of emails?
I know which one I am on a Monday morning.
Regardless of which camp you align with, the source text pivots to a reality that unites almost all coffee drinkers, regardless of whether they drink it black or drowned in oat milk.
They move from the philosophical to the physical.
Yes, the transcript gets incredibly candid here. Emma stops talking about the aesthetics of cafes and describes her actual dynamic with coffee as precarious.
Precarious, that's a strong word.
She openly admits that while she adores the beverage, she is fully physiologically dependent on it, and she recognizes that those are two very distinct, sometimes conflicting concepts. Loving something and needing something are not the same thing.
She shares a story about what happened when she skipped her morning cup because she was running behind schedule.
The symptoms she describes are remarkably severe for something we consider a casual morning drink. By midday, she says she was grappling with a splitting migraine, a notoriously foul temperament, and functioning like a lethargic zombie, perpetually on the verge of nodding off at her keyboard.
A lethargic zombie. And John doesn't even offer an ounce of sympathy.
None at all.
He just clinically labels it the quintessential withdrawal. He explains that this is the crux of caffeine dependency.
Which brings us to another key vocabulary lesson.
Right. They define caffeine organically in the conversation as a central nervous system stimulant that induces alertness and actively wards off drowsiness. When you routinely flood your brain with a stimulant and then suddenly deprive your body of it, your system aggressively rebels.
What's fascinating here is the language the source uses to describe a completely normalized societal addiction. We don't often frame our morning coffee routine as mitigating withdrawal symptoms, but medically and scientifically speaking, that is exactly what is happening for millions of people.
It really is.
The text uses highly dramatic, almost theatrical language to describe this biological process. Emma talks about facing dire physiological repercussions, and John talks about being resurrected back to humanity.
I mean, it is funny, but it's also a little dark when you step back and look at it. We joke about, don't talk to me until I've had my coffee, but we are literally talking about self-medicating to reach a baseline of human function.
And John's description of his morning routine is practically poetry.
It really is. He talks about the anticipation of the caffeine kicking in.
Kicks in being the phrasal verb they highlight here, meaning when the substance begins taking effect.
He says that pre-coffee, his internal world is desolate and sluggish. He consumes the coffee, endures what he calls a 20-minute latency period while it enters his bloodstream, and then the neurological switch finally flips. The caffeine takes effect, vibrancy is restored to his vision, and he says, metaphorical birds begin to sing.
The contrast they draw is brilliant. Emma's experience of dependency is framed negatively. She drinks coffee to avoid the agony of the zombie state.
The stick.
Exactly. While John's dependency is framed positively. He chases the euphoric return of the metaphorical birds. That's the carrot.
But both of them are entirely chained to the substance. This naturally leads to Emma asking John if he has ever contemplated trying to cut back on his consumption, just making a conscious effort to mitigate or reduce his intake.
And John's reaction is basically, I've thought about it, but actually doing it, absolutely not. He has no intention of abandoning his birds.
Emma admits she tried a coffee detox once and only lasted a mere 48 hours because the cranial throbbing was so excruciating she couldn't function.
If we connect this to the broader historical picture, it makes perfect sense why we are all so dependent.
How so?
The widespread adoption of coffee actually coincided with the Industrial Revolution. Before coffee and tea became cheap and widely available, European workers largely drank weak beer or ale throughout the day because the water wasn't safe. You had an entire workforce operating under a mild, continuous buzz of alcohol.
Wait, seriously? The whole workforce was mildly drunk?
Essentially, yes. They were operating on agrarian sun cycles. It didn't matter as much. But the Industrial Revolution required precision. It required clock time, long shifts, and operating dangerous machinery.
You can't be buzzed around machinery.
Right. Caffeine was the perfect chemical catalyst for the modern worker. It shifted the workforce from depressants to stimulants. It literally fueled modern capitalism. So when Emma and John talk about being unable to function without it, they are echoing a centuries-old reliance that built the modern world.
That context makes the next part of their debate even more hilarious, because John suggests that if Emma wants to cut back without the migraines, she should try decaf.
Decaf, meaning coffee that has had the vast majority of its caffeine meticulously extracted through various chemical processes.
John argues it's a great transition tool, noting that it mimics the sensory experience of a hot mug without the stimulatory effects, and he claims it has a valid psychological placebo effect.
And Emma's reaction to the concept of decaf is visceral.
It might be my favorite part of the entire transcript. She completely dismisses decaf as a mere charade. She says drinking decaf is the equivalent of attending a rock concert played at a whisper.
A brilliant analogy.
What on earth is the point of being there? She then equates the psychology of people who drink decaf to people who voluntarily wake up at 4 a.m. for leisure. She finds both psychologies equally baffling and slightly suspicious.
It is a hilarious analogy, but it underscores her fundamentally utilitarian worldview. For Emma, the sensory experience of coffee, the taste, the warmth, the smell, is entirely secondary to its chemical function.
The caffeine.
If you remove the chemical function, the beverage simply ceases to have a purpose for her. Why attend a silent rock concert? But John's defense of the placebo effect is actually rooted in real behavioral psychology.
Really? So the decaf placebo is a real thing?
Absolutely. The human brain loves rituals. Over time, your brain associates the smell of roasted beans, the warmth of the mug, and the bitter taste with the impending arrival of a stimulant.
It anticipates the hit.
Yes. If you drink decaf, your brain experiences all those sensory cues and often preemptively releases a mild burst of energy or alertness, anticipating the caffeine that usually follows. John isn't crazy for utilizing it. He understands that part of the addiction is to the ritual itself, not just the chemical.
But Emma isn't having any of it, which brings up their daily quotas. Emma pushes 3 to 4 heavily caffeinated cups a day, which she consumes rapidly, like an urgent medical prescription to keep the migraines at bay.
While John, on the other hand, has a strict maximum of 2 cups of coffee per day.
Emma is baffled by how he sustains consciousness in the late afternoon on just 2 cups. John explains that he relies on a gentler pick-me-up later in the day, usually tea.
It's a vital concept they introduce here. A pick-me-up is anything that revitalizes you or restores your waning energy when you hit that inevitable afternoon slump.
What's important is that John clarifies a pick-me-up isn't exclusively relegated to beverages.
Right. Coffee is a highly potent pick-me-up. Tea is a milder one. But he notes that even a brisk stroll in the crisp air or listening to an upbeat song can serve as an effective pick-me-up. It encompasses anything that elevates your vitality or mood.
But Emma, predictably, says her pick-me-up is unequivocally coffee. It's always coffee, morning, noon, or night.
Of course it is.
So up to this point, they've covered the linguistics of the menus, the aesthetics of the brew, and the brutal physical dependency of the caffeine. But the source text zooms out even further here. It shifts from looking at the individual to looking at how this beverage shapes human interaction on a macro level.
This is perhaps the most profound sociological insight in the entire transcript. They transition from the physical grip of the beverage to its societal function. They describe coffee not just as a drink, but as a profound social lubricant.
Think about the default proposition for initiating a rendezvous with someone, whether it's a first date, catching up with an old college friend, or a low-stakes business meeting. As Emma points out, the default phrase is almost universally, "Let's grab a coffee."
Let's grab a coffee.
But John rightly notes that the integrity of the coffee itself is rarely the actual priority in these situations. The priority is cultivating the interpersonal connection. The beverage is merely a socially acceptable pretext.
The underlying objective is the dialogue. When you ask someone to catch up over coffee, you are inviting them to convene and exchange recent life updates. The phrase catch up perfectly blends the social action with the physical environment. But it raises a really poignant question about modern social dynamics. Why do we need a pretext?
I was just thinking that It's almost sad that we feel we need an excuse to simply talk to one another. We can't just text a friend and say, let's sit in a quiet room for 45 minutes and exchange emotional vulnerabilities.
That sounds terrifying and intense.
It does, but if we say, hey, let's grab a coffee, suddenly it's entirely normalized.
Exactly. It acts as a shield. The coffee provides a physical activity for your hands, giving you something to do when you feel awkward, and it provides a shared focal point that relieves the pressure of constant eye contact.
Oh, that's a great point about eye contact.
If a conversation gets too intense or stalls, you can simply take a sip of your drink. It is a brilliant, built-in social mechanism for pacing human interaction.
And the environment itself plays a massive role. Emma notes that some of her most profound existential conversations have transpired within the walls of a cafe. They discuss how cafes provide a laid-back, unhurried ambiance. It's a sanctuary for substantive discourse.
A sanctuary.
What is it about this specific environment that fosters that kind of connection? Why don't we have these same deep conversations at the grocery store?
John brings up the physical act of cradling a warm ceramic mug and connects it to a person's willingness to be emotionally vulnerable. And there is actually hard empirical truth to this. It's a field known as embodied cognition.
Embodied cognition. How does that work with a coffee mug?
It's the idea that our physical sensations directly influence our psychological states. There are famous psychological studies where participants were asked to briefly hold either a hot cup of coffee or an iced coffee before being introduced to a stranger.
Okay.
The participants who held the warm cup consistently rated the stranger as having a warmer, more generous, and more trustworthy personality than those who held the cold cup.
You're kidding. Just the physical temperature of the cup altered their perception of a human being.
Yes. The physical warmth of the mug literally primes the brain for emotional warmth and trust. When you combine that tactile warmth with the cozy, softly lit, unhurried corners of a cafe, you are stepping into an environment biologically optimized for vulnerability and connection.
That is incredible. And John contrasts this perfectly by pointing out that you rarely engage in philosophical debates under the harsh fluorescent lights of a fast food chain.
It's so true.
Fast food restaurants are designed with bright, aggressive lighting and hard, uncomfortable seating, specifically to encourage high turnover. They want you in and out. Cafes are architecturally designed to encourage lingering. They want you to stay. And this environment encourages the physical act of sipping.
Right. To sip means to consume a liquid deliberately, in minuscule increments. It contrasts sharply with gulping or chugging. John notes that sipping evokes a highly serene tableau. The act of sipping paces the conversation. It creates natural pauses for reflection.
Like we said before, giving you a break.
Yes. You listen to your friends share something difficult, and instead of rushing to fill the silence, you take a slow sip while considering what they just said. The pacing of the beverage dictates the pacing of the dialogue.
Which Emma immediately ruins, of course.
Naturally.
She reminds us that at 7 a.m., she is rapidly downing her dark roast as if it were an urgent medical prescription, which is definitely not the epitome of a serene tableau. But it really makes you marvel at how a simple drink facilitates so much human connection.
It's a unifying ritual. But as unifying as it is, John also recognizes that the type of coffee we order is highly individualized. Which brings us to the final and arguably most entertaining section of their discussion.
I love this part.
John introduces a psychological exercise that he calls the coffee personality matrix.
He claims that you can accurately categorize human beings based entirely on their default coffee order. He turns the cafe menu into a personality test.
It is a sharp, satirical observation of modern generational archetypes. We love categorizing ourselves and others based on consumer choices. It's a way of making sense of the world. Let's walk through John's matrix because it is devastatingly accurate.
First up, we have the unadulterated black coffee drinkers. According to John, these people are pragmatic, no-nonsense, starkly honest, highly efficient, and marginally intimidating.
Emma immediately concurs with this. She notes that purists fit this description perfectly. They don't have time for frills. They want the raw fuel.
Then we have the oat milk latte demographic. John describes this person as an avid yoga practitioner who tends to a houseplant named something inexplicably human, like Bartholomew.
Bartholomew the houseplant.
I laughed out loud at that detail when I read it. Emma asks him, why Bartholomew? And John explains that it's a well-documented phenomenon that botanically inclined millennials and Gen Zers love to personify their flora. It's such a hyper-specific, brilliant read of a certain cultural aesthetic.
It really is.
Yeah.
But if we dig into why they do that, it reveals a lot about that generation. Sociologists suggest that younger generations, who are often priced out of traditional milestones like homeownership or having children early, channel those innate caretaking instincts into houseplants and pets.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Naming a fern Bartholomew is a playful but deeply revealing coping mechanism for modern isolation. When John links the oat milk latte to Bartholomew the houseplant, he isn't just making a joke about milk alternatives. He is painting a complete picture of a specific lifestyle, a set of anxieties, and a value system focused on wellness and comfort. Ordering an oat milk latte is a broadcast of those values.
It's eyeball signaling in a cup.
Precisely.
Next up on the matrix, we have the espresso loyalists, the ones who order a singular, highly concentrated shot in a tiny cup. John calls them the Wall Street brokers of the coffee world.
They operate in a state of perpetual urgency. Time is their most valuable currency. They don't linger. They throw the shot back at the counter and vanish into the street.
And finally, John outlines the purveyors of the syrup-drenched whipped cream extravaganzas, those massive iced blended drinks that barely contain any actual coffee.
He labels these consumers unapologetic hedonists.
Unapologetic hedonists. They prioritize immediate joy over dietary prudence and remain blissfully indifferent to societal judgment.
A great matrix. You hear those descriptions and you immediately start placing your friends, your coworkers, and yourself into those categories. Are you the intimidating black coffee pragmatist, the Bartholomew-owning millennial, the Wall Street broker of espresso, or the unapologetic hedonist?
But here is where the text delivers a fantastic, very human twist. After setting up this entire matrix, and after spending the entire transcript championing purist, artisanal coffee and 12-hour extractions, John makes a hypocritical confession.
He reveals his ultimate guilty pleasure. And the text defines a guilty pleasure as an indulgence one thoroughly enjoys, despite harboring a lingering sense of shame or embarrassment about it because it violates their stated principles or tastes.
And what is John, the incredibly sophisticated purist's ultimate guilty pleasure? He admits that on particularly grueling, emotionally exhausting days, he abandons all his artisanal principles and becomes a clandestine consumer of syrup.
A clandestine consumer of syrup.
He marches into a mainstream chain cafe, orders the most gastronomically absurd, sugar-laden, whipped cream-topped beverage available, and shamelessly relishes every single sip.
Emma calls him out so brilliantly here. She labels him a closeted fancy coffee enthusiast with severe lapses in culinary judgment. But what this confession really illustrates is the gap between our projected identities and our comforting reality.
Yes. Say more about that.
Well, John projects the identity of the sophisticated purist. He wants the world to see him as the guy who appreciates subtle notes of cacao and understands the chemistry of cold extraction. That is his aspirational self.
It's who he wants to be.
But his comforting reality, what he actually seeks when his defenses are down, when he is stressed and tired, is just a massive dose of childhood nostalgia, sugar, and comfort.
We all do this. We project our idealized selves to the world, the version of us that reads classic literature and drinks single-origin black coffee. But we all have that clandestine indulgence we turn to when the world gets too heavy. The reality TV show, the terrible pop song, the ridiculous sugary drink. John is just a tired, sugar-seeking human like the rest of us.
Which is a remarkably empathetic and grounded place for the source text to land.
Yeah.
It strips away all the pretension of the artisanal cafe, it drops the debate over roasting techniques, and it brings the conversation back to basic human comfort. It reminds us that behind all the performative consumerism, we are just people trying to get through the day.
That is perfectly stated, and I think it brings us beautifully to the end of our deep dive into brewing fluency. To synthesize our key takeaways, this source material provided an absolute masterclass.
It really did.
Yes, it was a masterclass in linguistic nuance, exploring the concepts of brewing, acquired tastes, the science of caffeine kicking in, the struggle to cut back, and the comforting embrace of a guilty pleasure. But, far more importantly, it was a masterclass in understanding how a simple little roasted bean has managed to conquer our language, hijack our nervous systems, facilitate our social lives, and define our modern tribal identities.
Indeed. It proves that the mundane artifacts of our daily routines often hold the most profound insights into who we are. If there is a final thought to take away from an analytical perspective, it is a reiteration of John's closing sentiment in the text.
Which was?
Whether your palate leans toward the elegantly simple, utilitarian black coffee or the extravagantly complex 12-hour extracted artisanal brew, the underlying message is to remain present. The true value isn't just in the chemical makeup of the liquid, it's in the ritual itself. Relish the physical experience, the warmth of the mug, the pause in your day, and more importantly, relish the human connections that the ritual provides a pretext for you to cultivate.
I love that. And I want to leave you listening right now with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. The text makes it abundantly clear that we rely on grabbing a coffee as a necessary built-in pretext for emotional vulnerability. It's the shield we use to slow down and talk to one another in a society that demands constant speed.
We need that shield.
So imagine a hypothetical scenario. If coffee, the plant, the bean, the beverage were to suddenly and permanently disappear from the earth tomorrow, what new ritual would society have to invent? What would be our new socially acceptable excuse to just sit down, slow our pace, hold something comforting in our hands, and truly listen to each other?
That's a great question to leave on.
Think about that the next time you are standing paralyzed in front of a bewildering cafe menu trying to decipher the phonetics. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure to unpack this with you. Until next time, take care.
Have you ever noticed how the simple act of choosing your morning beverage can feel, I don't know, less like a minor dietary preference and more like you are declaring allegiance to an entire lifestyle?
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive psychological signifier.
Right. Think about it for a second. You wake up, you stumble into the kitchen, the lights are barely on, and that very first choice you make, what goes into your mug, somehow sets the entire psychological tone for the rest of your day.
It really does. It's almost as if you are choosing a character class in a video game before stepping out your front door.
Yes, exactly like that.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to explore exactly why that is. We are taking a deep dive into a really, really fascinating piece of source material today.
It's a great one.
It is. It's a transcript originally designed for advanced English learners, and it's titled The Steeping Tradition: Tea Culture and Linguistic Nuance.
Which sounds very academic, but the themes are incredibly universal.
Completely. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore how a single ancient beverage fundamentally shapes our modern psychology, our deeply ingrained social rituals, and even the very words we use to communicate with one another.
Because as we are about to find out, your mug holds a whole lot more than just leaves and hot water.
Okay, let's unpack this.
It really is an incredibly rich source text. And what we are going to see as we sift through these concepts is that we aren't just looking at the mechanics of making a hot drink.
Right.
We're actually looking at a remarkably accurate mirror for human behavior. It operates as this unique lens through which we can understand how we socialize, how we unconsciously project our status to the people around us, and
how we cope with the overwhelming speed of the modern world.
Precisely. Perhaps most importantly, how we cope with that speed. The text uses tea as a baseline to explore some incredibly complex cultural evolution.
And the source kicks things off by addressing a phenomenon that I think anyone who spends time on the internet will instantly recognize.
The comment sections.
Oh, the comment sections. The authors of the transcript mentioned that a previous discussion they hosted about coffee sparked what they vividly describe as a culinary battlefield in their comment section.
People get very defensive.
Intensely, fiercely territorial about their caffeinated beverages. The text draws a really sharp contrast between the two dominant drink cultures. It defines coffee as the high-octane fuel for modern hyperproductivity.
Which is such an aggressive way to phrase it, but so accurate.
It is. And they note it is entirely centered around immediate gratification. But tea is described as the quintessential elixir for introspection, patience, and tranquility.
Quintessential elixir.
I found that phrasing so striking. It almost sounds like a potion you would find in a fantasy novel, not something you pick up at the grocery store.
It does have a certain mythic quality to it, for sure. But if we break down the psychological states demanded by these two beverages, that contrast makes perfect sense.
How so?
Well, let's look at that phrase you mentioned first, the culinary battlefield. What does it actually reveal about modern tribalism?
That we take our morning routines way too seriously.
Well, yes, but deeper than that. We live in an era where productivity is often treated as the ultimate virtue. If you aren't producing, you are falling behind.
The hustle culture mindset.
Exactly. Coffee, as the text notes, is that high-octane fuel. It is fundamentally designed to propel you forward, to accelerate your output. It is a transaction.
You consume it specifically so you can do something else faster or better.
Right. The fact that people go to battle in a comment section over this shows how deeply intertwined our personal identities have become with our daily output.
Oh, wow.
When you attack someone's coffee, you are essentially attacking their productivity engine.
That is a wild way to think about it, but it makes so much sense.
And tea, however, asks for something entirely different from the drinker. It demands a psychological shift away from that output-driven mindset.
Though I do wonder if sometimes a coffee is just a coffee. But I see the broader cultural point the text is making. With coffee, the goal is immediate gratification. Get the caffeine in the bloodstream now.
The sooner the better.
Right. With tea, the ritual itself is paramount. It's the difference between slamming an energy drink in your car before a stressful meeting and sitting by a window, just watching the rainfall.
It alters your physical momentum.
You can almost picture the vivid imagery here, just in the verbs we use. Think about how we talk about coffee. We say, we are going to grab an espresso.
I'm just going to grab a coffee real quick.
Yes, grab. It's an aggressive verb. It's fast. It's something you snatch on the run while you are already thinking about the next thing on your to-do list. But you rarely hear someone say they are going to grab a tea.
No, you don't. The deliberate nature of the drink completely changes your physical momentum.
Precisely. And the language we use is always a leading indicator of our psychological state.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to ask what the implications are for a society that overwhelmingly prioritizes that high-octane fuel.
It's a little scary to think about.
We really have to wonder if we are actively losing our capacity for introspection because we are constantly prioritizing hyperproductivity.
Because if your entire day is structured around immediate gratification,
and you are constantly seeking the fuel required to maintain that aggressive speed, where is the space left for deep thought?
there isn't any. You're just constantly moving.
The source identifies tea as an elixir for patience. The underlying implication there is really profound. Patience is now something we need a remedy for.
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
It is something we have to actively cultivate with an elixir because our modern environment does not naturally provide it anymore.
It is almost like tea is functioning as a prescribed medication for the modern condition. We are so starved for patience that we have to drink it.
It is a liquid intervention.
And here is where it gets incredibly literal. It is not just the abstract, poetic concept of the drink that forces this patience upon us. It is the literal physical mechanics of preparing it.
You cannot rush the chemistry.
Exactly. The source points out that you simply cannot rush this process no matter how much you might want to. The physical act of making tea forces deceleration.
It physically stops you.
It notes that the water has to be at a precise temperature. If it is too hot, if it is at a rolling, aggressive boil, you will scorch the delicate leaves.
Which ruins the entire cup.
And then you have to submerge those leaves in the liquid and just wait. That is the definition of the C2 vocabulary word, steep, that the text highlights.
Yes, to steep.
You submerge it to extract the flavor.
The mechanics of steeping serve as a fantastic physical metaphor. Let's break down what happens when you try to apply the coffee mindset, that need for speed and immediate gratification, to the steeping process.
It's a disaster.
It is. If you rush it, if you use boiling water that is too aggressive because you don't want to wait for it to cool to the proper temperature, you scorch the leaves.
You literally burn the potential out of it.
You ruin the result. The consequence of rushing is a bitter, astringent, unpleasant outcome. That is such a powerful, tangible metaphor for rushing through life in general.
Oh, that is good.
If you apply too much heat and too much speed to delicate situations, whether that is a relationship, a complex project at work, or even just processing your own emotions, you ruin them. You extract bitterness instead of nuance.
Right. And the source uses a very specific phrase to describe what proper steeping requires. It says it requires a quiet endurance that our fast-paced society often lacks.
Quiet endurance.
Quiet endurance. That phrasing really makes you pause. I initially read that and thought, endurance to make a cup of tea. Isn't that a bit dramatic?
It sounds like a marathon.
Right. But the more you think about how hard it is to just stand still in a kitchen for 5 minutes without picking up your phone, the more accurate it feels.
I don't think it's dramatic at all when you contextualize it within our modern attention spans. Let's look at why that specific phrasing matters.
Okay.
Endurance usually implies a physical trial. You endure a marathon, you endure climbing a steep mountain. It implies difficulty, friction, or resistance against an opposing force.
So what is the opposing force here?
By pairing it with quiet, the text is suggesting that simply sitting still and waiting for the leaves to release their flavor is in itself an act of resistance. The opposing force is the modern urge to move quickly.
The urge to check your email?
To check your email, to scroll through social media, to move on to the next task on the whiteboard. The context sentence they provide in the transcript is wonderfully prescriptive. It says, you must allow the herbal infusion to steep for a minimum of 5 minutes.
Those 5 minutes are a forced pause.
They are a mandated timeout from productivity.
And 5 minutes can honestly feel like an absolute eternity when you are deeply conditioned to expect instant everything. You put a pod in a machine, push a button, and you have coffee in 20 seconds.
The modern luxury of speed.
But standing there watching leaves slowly change the color of the water, it is like the universe is putting you in a timeout. You are forced to confront your own impatience.
And that forced pause actually explains why people still bother making tea this way instead of just taking a caffeine pill.
Right, because we actually crave the pause.
Which brings us to one of the most compelling arguments the source makes, the concept of tea as a conscious relic. The required patience isn't just a physical requirement for a good beverage, it acts as a psychological anchor.
Yes, the text argues that tea preparation retains its massive global appeal, specifically because it is an anachronism.
A great vocabulary word.
Such a great word. Let's make sure we define that for the listener. An anachronism basically means something that is totally out of its correct historical or chronological time period. It is an inconsistency.
Like a glitch in the timeline.
Exactly. Imagine seeing a knight in full plate armor riding the subway. That is a visual anachronism. It is a relic of a bygone era. And the source argues that we consciously, deliberately preserve this specific anachronism to anchor ourselves.
What's fascinating here is the paradox when you really examine it.
How so?
Think about it. Why do modern people who are surrounded by instant technology, who have literally all of human knowledge at their fingertips, consciously choose to engage in an inefficient, time-consuming practice?
Because it makes no logical sense.
Yeah. None. We could easily engineer a synthetic tablet that tastes exactly like Earl Grey and gives you a mild, sustained caffeine lift instantly. The technology exists.
But we don't want that tablet.
No, we don't. We choose to boil water, wait for the temperature to drop, and watch leaves unfurl. It is a deliberate rebellion against the modern rush.
So by engaging in an anachronism, we are stepping out of the current timeline.
We are giving ourselves permission to exist in a slower, less demanding era, even if just for those 5 minutes. It is a way of reclaiming our time from the demands of efficiency.
The source gives such a brilliant real-world example to illustrate this feeling. It says, quote, "In the age of smartphones, his reliance on a mechanical typewriter felt like a charming anachronism."
That is a perfect parallel.
You can completely see the parallel there.
Yeah.
A mechanical typewriter offers incredible tactile feedback. It requires you to strike the keys with physical intention.
You can hear the mechanics working.
The clack of the keys, the ding of the carriage return. It is objectively inefficient compared to typing on a smartphone or laptop, where you can delete paragraphs in a millisecond.
But that physical inefficiency is exactly the point.
The brain actually craves that physical friction. The ritual of tea offers that exact same tactile sensory feedback. You feel the heat of the mug, you smell the steam, you watch the color change. It is basically a mechanical typewriter for your soul.
That is a very apt comparison. Frictionless technology often leaves us feeling disconnected from the physical reality of our world.
We just float through our days on screens.
We need these sensory, tactile resets to remind us that we inhabit physical bodies, not just digital spaces. And this need for an anchor, this need to step outside of the relentless forward march of time, isn't just a solitary individual experience.
It's a global phenomenon.
We look globally, we see how this simple botanical ingredient, just leaves from the Camellia sinensis plant, has been elevated to extraordinary heights to serve this exact psychological purpose.
Oh, absolutely. I want you to imagine how this need for a psychological anchor manifests differently depending on the cultural backdrop you're in.
It adapts to the environment.
It does. The source explores this beautifully by discussing the immense ceremonial gravitas that tea carries around the world. It highlights 3 very distinct styles of tea culture to show this range.
And the contrast is striking.
First, they describe the meticulously choreographed Japanese matcha ceremony. Second, they contrast that with the robust Indian chai boiling on busy street corners. And third, they bring up the highly formalized, rule-heavy British afternoon tea.
It is wild to think that one single plant can be the center of such wildly different human practices.
It's just leaves and water, but it becomes 3 completely different worlds.
It really is a testament to human adaptability and how we mold our environments to suit our specific cultural needs. Let's spend some time synthesizing these 3 descriptions because the contrasts are magnificent and they tell us so much about what different societies value.
Let's start with Japan.
In the Japanese matcha ceremony, you have this quiet, deliberate, almost hyper-focused choreography. Every single movement, from how the bowl is wiped to the specific angle of the bamboo whisk, is calculated.
Nothing is left to chance.
It is deeply steeped in Zen philosophy and the concept of finding perfection in the imperfect. It is a profoundly inward-facing ritual. The environment is usually sparse, quiet, and designed to eliminate external distractions. It is about immense, quiet focus.
Right, it's about stripping away the noise. You are isolating the experience to achieve that tranquility we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
But then the text pivots entirely. You travel to India, and the description of chai boiling on street corners is the exact opposite of sparse and quiet.
It is incredibly vibrant.
The text describes it as robust. It is energetic, it is intensely communal, and it is loud. You have the smell of cardamom and ginger mixing with the exhaust of passing rickshaws.
A sensory overload.
You have the clinking of small glasses, people shouting over the noise of the street. The reverence for the tea is absolutely still there. It is a daily anchor, but it's integrated directly into the vibrant hum of daily life rather than being isolated away in a quiet room.
And we should consider how these distinct ceremonies reflect the broader values of the cultures that practice them.
The environment shapes the anchor.
The focus on mindfulness, minimalism, and aesthetic precision in the matcha ceremony reflects deeply held values of harmony, respect, and internal discipline.
And the chai.
The energetic communal sharing of chai on a bustling street corner reflects a culture that finds connection, vitality, and social cohesion in shared, robust public spaces. Tea acts as the great equalizer in that environment. Everyone stops for chai.
It just highlights how this one botanical ingredient completely adapts to different cultural psyches. It is like the ultimate chameleon. In Japan, the anchor is silence and precision. In India, the anchor is community and sensory immersion.
And then, of course, we have the third example from the text, which introduces an entirely different kind of anchor. Ah, yes.
While the first two focus on spiritual mindfulness and vibrant social integration, this third one focuses heavily on social structure, hierarchy, and rules.
Which pulls our discussion directly into the highly formalized world of British afternoon tea.
The text does not hold back here at all.
It really doesn't. It describes this tradition as being fraught with unwritten protocol and goes so far as to call it a veritable minefield of social etiquette.
A veritable minefield.
And the prime example they use is something that honestly sounds terrifying if you aren't initiated into the rules. They describe the intense anxiety of navigating a scone.
The Great Scone Debate is legendary in the UK.
It is. The source explains that depending on where you are geographically, specifically whether you are in Devon or Cornwall, the rules for eating this tiny baked good completely change.
It's all about the order of operations.
Do you apply the thick clotted cream to the pastry first, or do you put the strawberry preserve on first? I just love picturing the sheer existential anxiety of this culinary minefield.
And can be quite daunting. Imagine you are invited to a high society event. You are sitting in a beautiful, historic dining room. The fine porcelain is clinking, everyone is dressed impeccably, the conversation is flowing, and you are just sitting there, sweating profusely, staring at a piece of bread and some jam.
Afraid to make the first move.
You are absolutely terrified that spreading your preserve first instead of your cream is going to instantly excommunicate you from polite society. The text explicitly states that a misstep here is considered a monumental faux pas.
It is a very humorous image to picture someone sweating over a pastry, but it actually speaks to a very deep, very serious human behavioral trait.
The fear of judgment.
Let's look at the concept of protocol that the source brings up. This is another excellent vocabulary word. We often think of protocol as just boring rules, the official procedure or system of rules governing affairs of state or diplomatic occasions.
Like treaty negotiations.
Right. But here it is applied to strict social etiquette. The text uses this context sentence. She observed the rigorous protocol of the dining room with flawless execution.
Flawless execution.
Now, this raises an important question that we have to ask. Why do human beings invent such high-stakes, stressful rules for something as fundamentally simple as consuming baked goods?
Seriously, at the end of the day, it is just bread, butter, and fruit. Why turn it into an Olympic sport of manners?
Because it is never just about the bread and the jam. Protocol, at its core, exists to signal belonging.
Belonging to the group.
When a society creates a complex web of unwritten rules, like the Devon versus Cornwall cream tea debate, those who naturally know and execute the rules demonstrate that they belong to the in-group.
It's a secret handshake.
They show they were raised in this culture, or at least educated in its finest nuances. Those who don't know the rules, who hesitate or put the cream on wrong, immediately reveal themselves as outsiders.
It is an unspoken language of social status and gatekeeping.
Navigating a veritable minefield of social etiquette requires a deep, almost instinctual understanding of the culture's historical norms. The anxiety you described isn't about the food, it's the primal anxiety of being rejected by the tribe.
That is deeply fascinating. So the scone is just the test. It is the mechanism they use to figure out if you belong at the table.
Exactly.
And violating those norms, stepping on one of those hidden social landmines and proving you don't belong, brings us to one of the most interesting linguistic borrowings in the English language, which the text highlights perfectly.
Yes, the term faux pas.
Right. Faux pas is a French loanword that has been thoroughly and seamlessly integrated into English.
It literally translates to a false step.
A false step, but it denotes a socially awkward, tactless, or embarrassing act. And the source brings up the ultimate quintessential T faux pas, extending the pinky finger.
The pinky finger.
Now, I have a personal anecdote here. Years ago, I was at a very fancy hotel for a meeting. They served tea in these incredibly delicate, paper-thin porcelain cups.
Setting the scene.
And I kid you not, without even thinking about it, I picked up the cup and my pinky finger shot straight out.
Okay.
I sat there drinking my tea, thinking I looked incredibly aristocratic, like I just stepped off the set of a period drama.
You felt very refined.
I genuinely thought I was blending in perfectly with the high society vibe of the lobby.
I imagine you are not alone in that. It is a wildly pervasive Hollywood stereotype. If you ask a child to pretend they are drinking fancy tea, the first thing they do is stick their pinky out.
Exactly. You see it in movies, cartoons, comic strips, everywhere. It is supposed to be the universal, globally understood shorthand for looking posh.
But the text completely shatters this myth.
It really does. It states in no uncertain terms that extending the pinky is actually considered highly pretentious and historically inaccurate.
Completely inaccurate.
It points out that true elegance lies in what it calls the understated grip of the saucer in the cup. When I read that, I instantly cringed, thinking back to my hotel lobby performance.
That moment of realization is a great example of the difference between performative elegance and true elegance.
The performance versus reality.
The loud, performative Hollywood elegance, the extended pinky, is ultimately about drawing attention to oneself. The subtext is, look at me, look at how refined and delicate I am holding this tiny cup.
It is an overcompensation.
It is. But the source defines true elegance as understated. In high society, true refinement is about making incredibly complex things look entirely effortless.
Which, sticking your finger straight out, is not.
Extending a pinky finger is an effortful, unnatural physical contortion of the hand. It requires tension. An understated grip, a natural resting of the fingers, shows that you belong in that elevated environment naturally without needing to put on a performance.
You don't need to try hard, because you already belong.
Exactly.
That makes so much sense, though it is slightly terrifying how easy it is to out yourself as an imposter while trying to fit in. It's the difference between shouting about your status and simply existing comfortably within it.
Well said.
The source provides a fantastic, severe example of a faux pas to really drive the weight of the concept home. The sentence is, asking the ambassador about his recent scandal during a formal dinner was a catastrophic faux pas.
You can just feel the air getting completely sucked out of the room in that sentence.
It is not just a little mistake, it is a social disaster.
A catastrophic misstep indeed. It breaks the established protocol of polite diplomatic evasion.
So what does this all mean? We have covered a lot of ground on the mechanics of this tradition. The way we approach tea, the deep patience it requires to steep, the elaborate cultural ceremonies we build around it to anchor ourselves.
The terrifying gatekeeping etiquette of scones and pinky fingers.
All of it is a reflection of who we are as social creatures. Which brings us to a really fascinating pivot in our source material. We have talked extensively about how we hold the tea and how we serve the tea.
The rituals surrounding it.
Now, the text moves into what kind of tea we actually choose to drink and what that specific choice says about our palates and our psychology.
The source moves into a deep discussion about discerning palates, and it does so by highlighting two very distinct, almost polar opposite tea preferences.
The flavor profiles.
It sets up a contrast. On one hand, we have the classic Earl Grey, and on the other, the much more divisive Lapsang Souchong.
Yes, and the sensory descriptions the authors use here are incredibly visceral. Earl Grey is described as featuring bergamot oil, which is extracted from a type of citrus fruit.
Very bright.
The text says it provides a delightful citrusy complexity. It sounds bright, elegant, refreshing, and very approachable. But then we get to lapsang souchong.
A completely different beast.
The source explains that this tea is heavily smoked over actual pinewood fires during its production. The aroma is described as aggressively campfire-esque. In fact, one of the speakers in the text jokingly describes it as a botanical bonfire.
Botanical bonfire.
What an absolutely masterful piece of imagery. Botanical bonfire. You don't even need to have tasted it. You can literally smell the pine smoke and feel the heat just hearing those two words.
It is highly evocative language, and it serves a distinct purpose in the text. This section is incredibly useful because it allows us to deeply explore the psychology of taste alongside some advanced vocabulary.
Let's look at the vocabulary.
The text brings up the concept of being partial to something and having a discerning palate. To be partial to something simply means having a distinct preference or a bias toward it.
You prefer it over other options.
You might say, while I enjoy most desserts, I am particularly partial to a dark chocolate ganache. It is an elevated way of saying you have a favorite, but it implies a level of experience. You have surveyed the landscape of desserts, you have tried the options, and your educated bias lands in a specific place.
Right. And that leads directly into the idea of being discerning. The text explains that to possess a discerning palate means to have or show refined judgment and taste.
It is the ability to notice subtle differences that other people might miss.
They use a great context sentence. The gallery owner possessed a discerning eye for emerging artistic talent. What I find so interesting in the transcript is the subjectivity of this.
The debate between the speakers.
The speaker who prefers the bright, approachable, citrusy Earl Grey playfully accuses the other speaker of lacking a discerning palate precisely because they prefer the aggressively smoky, overpowering lapsang souchong.
Which brings up a wonderful debate about how taste functions psychologically. Is the person who likes the aggressive flavor less discerning or more?
That is the big question.
Lapsang souchong is unequivocally what we call an acquired taste. No one takes a sip of a botanical bonfire for the first time and thinks it is smooth or easy to drink.
No, you're probably caught.
But let's look at how acquired tastes function biologically and psychologically. Biologically speaking, human beings are hardwired by evolution to reject intense bitterness or strong, acrid smoke flavors.
Because in nature, that usually means danger.
In nature, a bitter plant is often a toxic plant. The smell of strong smoke usually signals fire, danger, and destruction. Our primal brain says, spit this out or run away.
Well, I never thought about it like that. So when you drink it, your brain is initially flashing warning signs.
Exactly. To develop a genuine preference for lapsang souchong, or, for that matter, black coffee, very hoppy IPAs, or strong, pungent blue cheese, requires you to repeatedly expose yourself to the stimulus until your higher cognitive functions override your primal instinctual rejection.
You have to train your brain.
You teach your brain to look past the warning signs and begin to appreciate the complex underlying notes. Therefore, having a strong preference for a botanical bonfire actually is often the mark of a highly discerning, deeply experienced palate.
It requires sustained effort.
Sustained effort, learned appreciation, and the conquering of your own biology.
That is an amazing perspective. So by casually drinking this intense campfire tea, you are literally proving to yourself and anyone watching that your refined, educated taste has successfully conquered your primal survival instincts.
It is a quiet victory over nature.
That is a bizarre but brilliant flex. And speaking of conquering things, the source notes in its final section that tea hasn't just conquered our morning cups, our social calendars, and our primal instincts. It has completely and thoroughly saturated our language.
This is perhaps the most compelling linguistic takeaway from the entire source material. The English language is heavily reliant on tea-derived idioms to navigate complex social situations.
This gives us a whole toolkit.
The source unchecks 3 specific, highly useful idioms that reveal how we use the concept of tea to manage human relationships.
Let's dedicate some substantial time to each of these because they are so common you almost forget they are metaphors. The first one is probably the most famous, and I use it all the time. Not my cup of tea.
It is ubiquitous. And the source explains that this phrase is primarily used to soften rejection diplomatically.
Think about the social friction involved in stating a negative preference.
If a colleague invites you to a specific genre of music, a film, or an activity that doesn't align with your personal tastes, bluntly stating, I detest that or I hate that kind of movie, creates immediate social friction.
It feels like an attack on their taste.
By saying, it is not my cup of tea, you execute a perfect diplomatic maneuver. You take the burden of the mismatch entirely upon yourself.
It's not you, it's me.
You are not saying the thing they like is objectively bad. You are simply, gently stating that it doesn't match your specific subjective palate.
It is the ultimate diplomatic shield. The text provides a perfect example of this in action. Avant-garde theater is fascinating, but it is frankly not my cup of tea.
A very polite decline.
You validate the thing the other person likes, you call it fascinating, you give it worth, but you cleanly and politely remove yourself from having to actually participate in it.
It perfectly demonstrates how much human beings need these linguistic tools to navigate social friction without causing offense.
It is polite, it is understated, and it avoids unnecessary conflict. Kind of just like the proper understated way to hold a teacup.
A very astute connection. It is understated social maneuvering. The second idiom the source highlights tackles a different kind of social friction. The phrase is a storm in a teacup.
I love this one.
This refers to a disproportionate amount of outrage, drama, or anxiety over a matter that is ultimately trivial, petty, or inconsequential.
I have to say, I think this is one of the most brilliant visual idioms in the English language. It perfectly encapsulates the absolute absurdity of microscopic dramas, especially in places like an office or a neighborhood association.
The micropolitics of daily life.
I want you to picture the literal, physical imagery of the phrase. Imagine a violent, raging, destructive storm. Lightning, thunder, crashing waves. Now imagine all of that apocalyptic fury completely confined to the 3 square inches of a delicate porcelain cup.
It is ridiculous.
It makes the anger look incredibly silly, and the source paints a vivid picture with its example. It describes 2 colleagues having a furious, red-faced disagreement over who used the last printer cartridge without replacing it.
A classic office conflict.
To those 2 people, in that heated moment, it feels like a massive betrayal. It feels like World War III. But to an outside observer looking at the reality of the situation, it is clearly just a storm in a teacup.
It is a phrase that inherently provides perspective, which is why it is so useful. When you label a conflict a storm in a teacup, you are instantly de-escalating the perceived severity of the situation.
You are shrinking the problem.
You are telling the people involved that their emotions are far larger than the actual container of the problem. It reduces towering, destructive outrage to something manageable, contained, and ultimately harmless. It is a linguistic tool for restoring proportion.
It is basically a polite way of telling someone they are overreacting. And then we have the final idiom from the text, which is used for establishing hard limits. Not for all the tea in China.
The text notes this is an older expression, but it remains highly effective.
It essentially translates to under no circumstances whatsoever.
If we synthesize what these 3 phrases mean as a collection, they prove that tea is not just a drink we consume. It is a foundational pillar of English cultural expression.
It reflects our history.
The historical context of this last phrase is tied to the sheer vastness and immense wealth of the historic Chinese tea trade. For centuries, tea was one of the valuable commodities on the planet.
It built empires.
To say you wouldn't do something even if you were offered all that unimaginable wealth signifies an unbreakable, absolute boundary.
The example they use in the source is hilarious and very relatable. If someone asked me to jump out of a perfectly functioning airplane for a skydiving excursion, I would respond, I wouldn't do that for all the tea in China.
It is a completely rational boundary.
I am not jumping out of a plane either. And using this phrase uses the massive global scale of tea production to emphasize just how hard and unyielding that no really is.
It truly demonstrates the linguistic saturation of the beverage. Just look at the toolkit it provides us. We use tea to be polite and deferential. We use tea to provide perspective and shrink conflict down to size. And we use tea to establish our most rigid, unshakable personal boundaries.
It covers the entire spectrum of social interaction.
It really is incredible when you step back and look at it all in totality.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's just summarize the unbelievable journey this source material took us on today. We started with the physical mechanics, the quiet endurance required just to steep the leaves, pushing back against the high-octane, exhausting hyperproductivity of the modern world.
A forced deceleration.
We explored how the simple act of boiling water serves as a deliberate, tactile anachronism, a way of anchoring ourselves in an increasingly chaotic, frictionless age. We traveled globally, contrasting the deep, inward-facing ceremonial gravitas of Japanese matcha with the vibrant sensory explosion of Indian street chai.
The cultural adaptability is amazing.
We navigated the terrifying, gatekeeping, protocol-heavy minefield of British scone etiquette and learned exactly why extending your pinky is a massive, performative faux pas that you should definitely avoid at your next hotel meeting.
Keep the grip understated.
We analyzed the psychology of discerning palates, learning how craving a botanical bonfire proves we can conquer our own biology. And finally, we saw how deeply steeped our very language is in these concepts, using tea to soften rejection and manage office politics.
It is everywhere.
The source text ends by hoping this exploration inspires the reader to simply slow down, boil the kettle, and savor a moment of quiet reflection today. And I want to echo that directly to you listening. Take that 5 minutes, cultivate that quiet endurance, allow yourself to step out of the rush.
And as you do step out of the rush, I would leave you with one final, lingering idea to mull over.
I love a good final thought.
We have thoroughly explored how the intricate, somewhat inefficient, time-consuming ritual of tea has been consciously preserved as a necessary anachronism to anchor us against the chaos of modern life.
Yes, the mechanical typewriter for the soul.
But it makes you wonder about the rest of your routines. What other seemingly outdated, inefficient, quiet rituals in your own daily life might secretly be the very things holding your sanity together?
What a fantastic, provocative question to leave on. I am going to be thinking about that all day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the steeping tradition and the incredible weight of the things we drink.
It has been a true pleasure to unpack this material with you. Until next time.
Take care, everyone.